Welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. Lapvona is an interesting book because it has all the trappings of a dark medieval fantasy story, but it utilizes those elements in an entirely different way from anything I've seen before. There's very little plot, there are very few redeemable characters, there is pretty much no concern for traditional storytelling structure. Instead, the book focuses heavily on atmosphere and mood and tension and being upsetting. The characters certainly take action and things do still happen, but there's no real sense of a coherent journey. It's more just like a bleak, grotesque mosaic of moments from a year in the lives of these deeply miserable people. This is generally true of other Ottessa Moshfegh books I have read as well, Looking at You, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, but this time it's in a completely different setting. This book takes place over the course of about a year and is split up into sections corresponding with the different seasons. To dive into the actual content of the story, it centers on a boy named Marek, who is a physically deformed and emotionally stunted teenage boy who lives in the village of Lapvona with his deeply religious and abusive shepherd father, Jude. It's never specified exactly when or where this story takes place, but as opposed to other fantasy stories which take place in times and places that don't exist, it's heavily implied here that this story is all happening in medieval Europe somewhere with its heavy religious influence and undertones that are explicitly Christian. Marek and Jude both have a deeply troubling, masochistic relationship with God and Christianity. They essentially worship suffering. They think that it is holy and righteous, and that the more they suffer on earth, the more God will reward them in heaven. Pain to them is proof of piety, to alliterate apparently, and any earthly joy is seen as something that's suspicious or even sinful. So through this warped theology, they justify cruelty towards one another because that's what they think God wants. Jude abuses Marek, and Marek is attached to his abuse. The village of Lapvona is run by Lord William, who is an incredibly bizarre figure. He is extremely shallow and immature. He has the attention span of a child. He's always bored. He treats his servants like toys created for his own amusement. He forces them to entertain him with all sorts of menial and humiliating and disgusting tasks. He's cruel in a really banal sort of way. He even uses Father Barnabas, the village priest, to spy on the villagers and then secretly set bandits upon them if there are any rumors of dissent or ill will towards the lordship. I will say this book felt a bit directionless at times, so focused on atmosphere over story, and I'm not sure that it pulls off the medieval setting that convincingly, which I'll touch on, but I still think the main ideas worked well overall. The plot here, if you can call it that, comes into focus when Marek kills William's son, Jacob, kind of intentionally, kind of accidentally, hard to explain. Jude brings Marek to the Lord's estate to face the consequences, but instead of punishing him, William unexpectedly decides to adopt Marek as his own replacement son. And what follows from that is a completely bizarre and disorienting shift in Marek's life. He goes from being an abused, neglected outcast to suddenly living in privilege among the ruling class of this fiefdom. He is doted on by Lisbeth, the servant who formerly worked for Jacob and who is also his girlfriend, who now despises Marek for killing and replacing the boy she loved. And through all of this, despite his new life, Marek remains miserable and emotionally stunted and attached to his weird beliefs. Earlier in the story, it's revealed that Jude lied to Marek about his mother, Agatha, claiming she died in childbirth when, in reality, she ran away after unsuccessfully trying to abort him. I bring this up because shortly after Marek arrives to the lordship, Jude and Agatha, both of his parents, are brought in as servants. The entire dynamic of the Lord's estate is just incredibly surreal. It's all very uncomfortable and tense and strange. Everyone around William is living within his gross delusions, and this is all being juxtaposed with the village below, who are suffering from severe famine and drought. In fact, this drought is what constitutes the majority of the summer section of the book, and the way it's described is some of the most grim, horrifying writing I've ever read. There's no water, no food, people are starving to death, their bodies are wasting away as they resort to eating dirt and mud and insects and the remains of human corpses who have already died. The heat is relentless and oppressive, it just bakes the village into a kind of lethargic madness. And amid all of this suffering, William is hoarding a whole reservoir of water up at the estate. Even though the ruling class are all miserable in their own way, they are still completely disconnected from and indifferent to the suffering below them. Later on in the winter section, there's a whole chapter about Christmas, strangely enough. Earlier in the book, Jude rapes Agatha in a field, thinking that he's dreaming, and she ends up getting pregnant. William nor anybody else at the estate knows about this, so they assume that Agatha became pregnant through immaculate conception and is now about to give birth to the Messiah, which further solidifies their delusions about their own importance and their proximity to holiness. Religion in Lapvona is used to reinforce these delusions, like to recontextualize the vile into the sacred. There is a bit of levity when everyone at the estate is debating whether a new Messiah would nullify the concept of Christmas, seeing that Jesus is effectively being replaced, but the vast majority of this book just has this dark, hopeless aura to it. Everything about this place is just rotten, from the aristocracy to the peasants to the church, and the book just kind of dwells there. One character I haven't mentioned yet, who is possibly my favorite character in the book, is Ina. She's an incredibly old blind woman who lives alone on the outskirts of the village. She's also the town midwife slash wet nurse who at some point or another nursed pretty much every resident of Lapvona. She also continues to nurse a lot of them well into adulthood, even though she doesn't produce milk anymore. She introduces an interestingly supernatural element to this otherwise pretty prosaic story, which I thought was cool. She has some sort of spiritual connection to the earth. She can kind of communicate with animals, and at one point she replaces her eyeballs with these huge oversized horse eyeballs and is somehow able to see out of them. Even though she's described as this cretinous old witch, I appreciated how her presence suggests there's something else, like some ancient pagan naturalistic world that exists beneath the severe religious doctrine imposed on this community. A couple last things to mention. One, the prose in this book sometimes felt a little off to me. It's very blunt and simple and matter of fact, which gave it a kind of strange modern tone that didn't always sit right in the medieval setting. Hearing characters say things like, yeah, whatever, man, or just, I don't know, like certain ways things were articulated often felt more 21st century than 12th century, and it created a bit of an anachronistic feeling that was sometimes hard to ignore. This same style worked incredibly well in my Year of Rest and Relaxation, where that detached flatness suited the character and the setting, but in Lapvona, it occasionally pulled me out of the world. It's supposed to be a medieval story, but it just doesn't really feel medieval. That's kind of nitpicky though. As a whole, I did enjoy this book. I think Ottessa Moshfegh really excels at creating these unsettling, borderline repulsive characters, putting them in environments that strip away all pretense and comfort and just forcing you to sit with that. Lapvona is an ugly place filled with ugly people, but there's a kind of fascination in that, whatever it may be, and this book goes there. It's a bizarro fairy tale. It's not the kind of story that I would say I had a good time reading, but it is compelling in its own twisted way, and I respect it for that. I think I would give this book like a 6 or a 7.